Thank you all for joining today's discussion on delivering truly clean hydrogen with 24/7 carbon-free energy. Before I begin, I'd like to inform you that the workshop will be recorded. We will have approximately 45 minutes discussion today, but we will leave some time at the end for Q&A. Please feel free to leave your questions in the chat as we speak. So our focus is on the critical role of clean hydrogen in the global energy transition, but also on the importance of a strong emission accounting system for grid connection. When it comes to clean hydrogen, a robust body of research consistently identifies strong emission accounting system for grid-connected electrolysis that considers three main pillars: additionality, deliverability, and hourly matching. And these three pillars can ensure truly low or zero emitting hydrogen projects. There is a vivid ongoing debate on these principles, and some believe that if too regulated, clean hydrogen will be too expensive. On the other hand, if there is not enough regulation, we may end up subsidizing hydrogen projects that may result in increased net emissions. The bottom line is, we all want hydrogen to support the global decarbonization. And we are eager to learn more about this today from our panelists and engage in a very meaningful discussion. We hope that you find this webinar informative and thought-provoking as well. Let me then introduce our great panelists for the day and kick off the discussion. We have with us Killian Daly, Executive Director at Energy Tag, Rachel Fakhri, Senior Advocate, Natural Resources Defense Council, Daniel Esposito, Senior Policy Analyst at Energy Innovation, and Wilson Riggs, PhD candidate at Princeton University. So welcome to all of you. And let me kickstart immediately a discussion with Killian. Killian, I know that you have a presentation that you want to share. Can you start telling us a little bit more about the definition and the importance of the three pillars, and also the ongoing debate at EU level, but also at US level? Thank you.
Sure, thank you very much. Let me know if you can't see my slides. Yeah, so I'm Killian, I'm Executive Director at Energy Tag, which is focused on the next generation of clean electricity carbon accounting. Previously, I did work in the hydrogen sector for a number of years, focused specifically on this topic of three-pillar implementation in the European Union and across the world. So bringing that kind of perspective there as well to hopefully clarify a few points in this presentation. So first of all, as has been mentioned already, they're the three pillars. What we mean: grid-connected electrolysis, hourly match, deliverability, backed up by new / additional supply. And that is obviously, something that is very much aligned with the principles of the compact, the 24/7 compact, of which Energy Tag is one of the members. So this is the fundamental basis of really clean electricity when there's new load like hydrogen coming onto the grid, and I know the experts will cover in detail why this is important from an emissions perspective later on. Just to give an overview of what's going on around the world, this is not just a topic in the United States. It's very much a global topic anywhere where hydrogen is going to be produced at large scale. The EU will be three-pillar hydrogen after a transition phase by 2030. All renewable hydrogen produced and imported into Europe, I think it's a very important point, will have to meet these three criteria. And that sets like a first, let's say, international standard for what it means to be truly renewable hydrogen. There is a transition phase to the hourly tracking, which is out to 2030. That's a bit unfortunate, but it's for a number of reasons, including the fact that the EU's legislation for hourly tracking actually needs to be changed and amended, and that will take a bit of time. The United States has no such regulatory block. It's really important. The US this can happen more or less today. And obviously deviations in the United States would be more serious, as the US has no carbon price at a federal level, has less clean grids in general, and a larger subsidy there for the hydrogen. A couple of points around after the European rules were announced. Hydrogen Europe actually, which represents the EU hydrogen industry, said the rules can be met. They're strict, but they can be met. And that's in their public statements after the release of the Delegated Act. We were part of helping put together a progressive industry coalition in Europe with the likes of Iberdrola and EDP and Google, who asked for these three pillars to secure the role of hydrogen in a European energy future. And actually, project announcements have increased since the release of this delegated act, and a kind of a sign that this can happen absolutely, and this can be done in practice. Just to take a step back and more broadly, the 24/7 movement is actually something that is much broader than the hydrogen sector, even if that is a great initial example. So governments like the US government have a 24/7 target for their energy procurement. The UK's hydrogen standard is requiring 24/7. And other governments around the world as well are implementing regulations using this approach. Energy experts, so there's many models out there now showing that this is the best way forward for grid decarbonization and defining clean energy, from the IEA, Princeton, who are here today, and TU Berlin. A number of civil society organizations have signed on to letters, both in the US, like the NRDC on the call today, and in the European Union, calling for 3-pillar clean hydrogen. So that's a really important voice as well, as they want to make sure that the hydrogen we produce is clean and there's no shortcuts taken. System operators as well in Europe have called for this approach in general to better decarbonize our grids. And obviously there's the compact. I don't probably need to explain that, but there's 118 companies who've signed up to the principles introduced on the last slide. Just in terms of feasibility, maybe to touch as well on my own experience in the sector, absolutely the 3 pillars are possible in industry. Industry companies have signed letters in both the US and Europe saying so. There's examples of projects, 2 listed here, that are going to be doing this and that have announced that they're going to do, follow the real load of clean energy production as it's supplied on an hourly basis. So it's absolutely possible. Electrolyzers are flexible. I've worked on electrolyzers myself where we tested that flexibility. And I point here as well to some peer-reviewed data on the flexibility of various electrolyzer types. Hydrogen supply can also be firm with hourly matching. It doesn't mean that you have to turn off your downstream plant if you're doing hourly matching. Not at all. You can have very high capacity factor renewables, things like geothermal going up to 100%, or oversizing your wind to make sure you get really high capacity factors. You can also do things like storing hydrogen or the electricity. You can rely on existing production, which is going to be the case in many applications that will be replacing a bit of current grey hydrogen production. On the costs of this, there's going to be much more later from the other panelists, but I thought I'd like to just share a few things here around the feasibility to clarify some points. In terms of the tracking, this is another key aspect. We need to be able to track this electricity properly on an hourly basis, and absolutely that is also very much possible. It's being done all over the world today. So there's millions of megawatt hours already tracked on an hourly basis right now, from obviously leading organizations, as you can see around the map, and actually countries like Taiwan only allow tracking of electricity on a national basis, and that's been the case for many years there. So these systems are in existence. They're technically proven and already at scale around the world. So I think that also is a key point to keep in mind. We can do the tracking right. And obviously in the US, which is kind of more of the focus of today's conversation, even if the principles apply globally, hourly RECs required for that tracking. So renewable energy certificates, they're already available across the US. Providers like MRETs, PJM are already offering this service today. And therefore can offer it straight away for hydrogen as well, as long as the hourly data is provided by the production and consumption devices. Energy Tag obviously has a voluntary standard for hourly tracking and can help harmonize approaches in the United States if required. So that is it from me. I hope it's been a useful introduction, and I'll pass it back to Irina.
Thank you very much, Kilian. Very useful indeed. I think you gave a very good overview at global level, focusing on, first of all, the inclusion of the elements as we discussed in the regulatory framework, looking into feasibility and also the possibility, the real possibility of tracking at an hourly basis around the globe. Thank you so much for that. And we'll go now to Rachel. Rachel, how would you define clean hydrogen first? but also why there is a high risk, according to you, of subsidizing increased net emissions unless we define a clear regulatory framework from the very onset. And I know that you also have a presentation, right? Thank you so much, Rachel.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Irina, first for having all of us here. It's lovely to be with my colleagues, Wilson, Killian, and Dan. We're all working very closely on making sure the tax credits in the US, which I'll cover in a moment, are actually well implemented. We'll cover this today, Irina. It's quite simple, right? If this resource, hydrogen, which is an important clean solution to achieve our climate goals, if it were to actually support deep decarbonization, it has to be produced without emissions. This is the most intuitive thing, right, that we can think of. And that is exactly the crux of the fight. How do we make sure this is actually a clean energy solution that's not spurring emissions across the system that will derail our climate goals? That is precisely the crux of the fight. And these are where the pillars come in as the only system of guardrails to make sure this is actually a clean energy solution and will fulfill the decarbonization potential it has. And I know that Dan and Wilson have excellent presentations to show precisely how those perverse emissions impacts can happen without the three pillars, which is why we're really working hard to make sure that US agencies require the pillars. So with that, I am happy to share my screen. Again, Rachel Fakhri and I direct the Emerging Technologies portfolio for the Natural Resources Defense Council. We're based in the US, but we're a global environmental NGO with offices in India, China, and other places in Latin America. I will cover mostly the US landscape today. I think Killian gave an excellent overview of the global picture that has trickled into the US. So these pillars that Killian described, those are what we're fighting for in the US as well in the context of the Inflation Reduction Act clean hydrogen tax credit that was passed in the summer. So some of the key points I would love to have folks leave with today are, one, that the clean hydrogen tax credits have very high stakes. It's billions of dollars of taxpayers' dollars on the table and potential hundreds of tons of carbon emissions. So this tax credit can actually become a huge problem for the climate while being subsidized by a climate bill. It all really hinges on how the Biden administration will implement that credit. So as all mentioned, the Treasury Department, as well as the Department of Energy here and the White House are all working closely to figure out how to implement that credit. So whether it ends up being a climate boon or climate problem really depends on the Biden administration. Dan and Wilson will cover this very well, but as I teed up, the new kind of the three pillars of additionality and or new supply, which is the new sexy term we're using in lieu of additionality. Hourly matching and deliverability are the only system of guardrails that will ensure truly clean hydrogen is being subsidized. And I'll briefly cover the fight that's happening here. This is not unlike the big fight that happened in Europe around those pillars. Is being replicated in the US, and this is where the support of many of the 24/7 Compact members would be extremely helpful in making sure the direction of this credit is actually climate aligned. Very brief context setting, since I know that not everyone here is a hydrogen whiz. We currently use hydrogen in our economy in the US and globally. It is usually produced from fossil fuels, mostly natural gas in most places in the world. So if you want to use hydrogen as a decarbonization solution for some sectors like steel and aviation and so on, then we need to clean up its production. And this is where we have two main pathways to do so, essentially just slapping carbon capture on a process similar to what we use today is one option. Option two, which is where what we're most interested in, is to just change the process entirely. Instead of producing hydrogen from gas, produce it from water, split the water into its constituents, and we have much cleaner hydrogen. That is the focus of the fight in the US. It's this pathway. It's hydrogen produced from water and powered by electricity. Just by virtue of it being produced from water does not make it clean. And as we'll cover, this can actually be far dirtier than this without any strong regulations around how it's produced. So this is where the clean hydrogen tax credit comes in. This was part of the Inflation Reduction Act, which passed Congress in the US in August. As you may know, this is the largest climate bill in US history, offers roughly $400 billion in support and subsidies for clean energy solutions, and is set to take us much closer to our US climate goals now that it's passed. Hydrogen was very well taken care of in this policy. And actually, the clean hydrogen tax credit that passed is one of the larger subsidies in that package. It is based on the greenhouse gas emissions of hydrogen production. And this is really all meant to subsidize these two pathways. I showed the electrolytic, so based on water, and the carbon capture one, which is blue hydrogen. So this is where those are the emissions of today's status quo gas-derived hydrogen. As long as a project is 60% or more cleaner than today's hydrogen, they start getting subsidized by the bill by receiving a credit or a tax credit for every kilogram of hydrogen produced. The cleaner a hydrogen project is, the higher the subsidy. And the top prize really is that $3 per kilogram subsidy here, which is only eligible for very, very, very clean projects, 95% or more cleaner than today's hydrogen. And you can see that kind of jump from the roughly 94% to 95% more. And this is exactly what Congress wanted, right? Congress wanted to subsidize those truly very, very clean projects because those are the only ones that are really aligned with climate goals. This is a substantial subsidy and it's very long-lived. First of all, it's uncapped. So there's no limit to how big it can be. It can be more than $100 billion over its lifetime, if not more. Just to give you a sense of what that means for one project. So Killian teed up that there's a big project in Texas being announced to produce hydrogen from water, electricity. This project alone would be eligible for $3 billion of subsidies from the federal government. This is enormous as kind of one subsidy for one project. It's very long, excuse me, it's very long-lived. It's eligible for projects that commence construction as far as 2032, which means that, and it lasts for 10 years, which means that you can still have hydrogen projects by 2045 still being subsidized by this bill. And as I mentioned, the implications really hinge on how the US federal agencies, Treasury being in the driver's seat, but also supported by the Department of Energy, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the White House, will implement this credit. Because as I mentioned, the credit is tied to the greenhouse gas emissions of hydrogen production. And Treasury is tasked to determine a methodology or issue guidance for calculating the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions of hydrogen within 1 year of the passage of the IRA. And all federal agencies are closely engaged with Treasury considering the complexity of the issue. Great. I will briefly touch on the crux of the fight in terms of the complexity, but again, Wilson and Dan will cover this more rigorously. The complexity of calculating greenhouse gas emissions can be described as follows. It really actually varies by project configuration, right? If you have a hydrogen project that's not connected to the grid, it only is connected to a wind or solar farm producing hydrogen on site, that's easy, right? That's clearly has zero emissions. However, it gets much more complicated for projects that are connected to the grid, drawing a lot of grid power that is still very fossil heavy in the US. So producing a lot of emissions and just purchasing credits or offsets to net out those emissions. As many of you probably know, offsets are a very tricky topic because it's very hard to make sure they're actually effective at reducing emissions. So we need some sort of parameters or conditions or rules around the sort of offsets that are allowed to be used to claim the credit. And this is where essentially the pillars come in, right? This is especially true for electrolysis, which is a very electricity hungry process. More than 25% of electricity is lost to produce hydrogen, which means that even very small shares of fossil fuels in the electricity that is used to power the electrolyzer can result in very significant emissions. Just to give you a sense of how perverse of an impact we may have if the rules aren't strict enough, this essentially graph shows the carbon intensity of various hydrogen projects. This is basically where status quo hydrogen is today. This is hydrogen produced from water, but powered by today's US average grid. It's twice as bad. This is electrolytic hydrogen powered by coal electricity, 4 times as bad. That is the threshold to qualify for that top subsidy. Both of those can actually receive the subsidy if Treasury rules are weak and don't rely on the pillars. So we can have a very, very perverse effect where the US taxpayer is subsidizing projects worse than status quo, and this will result in a lot of emissions total, more than 100 million metric tons. We've seen much higher estimates. And again, this is where the three pillars come in. They're the parameters, conditions around those offsets to make sure that hydrogen emissions that are being produced are actually effectively being netted out. As Wilson and Dan will describe, this is the only system that ensures truly clean hydrogen as the IRA intended. I will not go into this too much, but I love putting in because NRDC is primarily a lawyers-heavy organization, and they produced an excellent legal explanation of why the three pillars are necessary to meet IRA requirements. I will describe it very simply. The IRA defines clean hydrogen by accounting for the impacts it will have on the system. So if a hydrogen project spurs fossil fuels on the system via weak Treasury rules, then those emissions have to be accounted for. And since the three pillars are the only system that will enable emissions to be truly very low, then they're legally necessary to meet IRA requirements, the way the IRA defines the boundaries. So we're happy to chat more about that, but I will skip it. And then finally, just a few words about the fight that's happening in the US. This is now becoming widely covered in media. Just put some excerpts of podcast articles that have been written about this issue over the past few months. It is becoming one of the most consequential fights in the US on climate this decade. Brief landscape of stakeholders. There are a lot of stakeholders pro three pillars, right? All the environmental groups in the US are pro pillars. Community and local justice and local environmental justice groups are pro three pillars, very concerned about seeing coal plants and gas plants ramp up, producing more emissions for their communities to produce hydrogen. Leading industry groups, which is really great to see, from hydrogen developers to renewable energy developers, also clearly showing and explaining why the pillars are feasible and good for business, but also academics and research groups like Princeton Energy Innovation present today, large customers like Google and other registries, and organizations like, of course, Energy Tag, which Killian represents today. Who's anti-pillars? It's largely industry groups, some industry groups. We have hydrogen developers, but again, counter it to hydrogen developers, also pro three pillars. Some utilities in some places in the US, and some renewable energy organizations, which worth noting, this is not unanimous across members, and we are seeing leading members extracting themselves out and supporting the three pillars, which is great. And then finally, just to give you a sense of why we're seeing opposition to the three pillars, it's really the broad theme is that it may not work. The three pillars may not work for specific companies' business model or intentions, right? So companies' anti-additionality are largely companies or utilities looking to use existing clean energy assets, which obviously is exactly counter to what additionality intends to do. So for example, existing nuclear plants to produce hydrogen, regardless of the emissions impacts of diverting this existing clean energy on the grid. And then we have the anti-hourly matching companies, which largely will be companies that are either looking to maximize subsidies and profits by running their electrolyzer quasi 24/7, which may not happen under hourly matching since you're more tied to the generation of the renewable energy. And of course, you're all fairly aware of that in this compact. Or have a business model or are located in a region where hourly matching may not pencil out at today's electrolyzer costs. And then the question is really that needs to be raised is the intent of a tax credit to make this work for everyone, everywhere, regardless of whether that's aligned with our climate goals, or is it meant to support the industry sufficiently to make it more widespread and let the market take it from there? And this is the crux of the fight here. So with that, I will pass it over to you again, Irina, and thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Rachel. That was very comprehensive and I think very well explained. You start with the additionality and the other two principles, explaining why this is the only system of guardrail that will make sure this won't become an actual problem for the climate, which I think it's what we all are hoping for. But we also gave a very good overview of the landscape of the different stakeholders. So as we said before, I mean, there are not only those that are pro, but there are also a lot of people that are anti. the three pillars, although I understand this is changing and there are some movements between one group and the other. And then also explaining very well to the audience why there is opposition. And yeah, I think this gave a very good overview. Thank you very much, Rachel. And with this, I will go to the next speaker. So Daniel, I will look at you now for discussing a little bit more the results that are currently emerging from your research, the research that has been carried out by Energy Innovation. It will be good to understand what are the factors that make hydrogen cost competitive in the current energy landscape and any other element that will emerge from your research. Thank you very much, Daniel, over to you.
Thank you, Irina. And hey, everybody, I'm Dan Esposito. I'm a senior policy analyst with Energy Innovation. And my background is in energy market analytics and clean energy project development. So just by way of background, for those who don't know, Energy Innovation is a nonpartisan climate policy think tank working with policymakers regardless of political affiliation. We provide objective research based on scientific assessments to identify the most effective economy-wide emissions reduction policies. I work on our electricity team, and part of my role is thinking through how to deploy and operate electrolyzers that make truly clean hydrogen and support the integration of higher shares of the grid. So as Rachel teed up, the US Inflation Reduction Act's Clean Hydrogen Production Tax Credit, or 45V, has huge implications for emissions and the industry's long-term growth. In a paper we released earlier this month, we argue that smart 45V guidance that follows those three pillars of additionality, deliverability, and time matching is one, essential for emissions reductions and the long-term growth of the clean hydrogen industry, two, implementable, and three, financially viable for projects that are compliant today. And Rachel and Killian already covered the implementation piece, so I'm mostly going to be focusing on the importance and financial viability of these rules. So let's start with the emissions impact. As a simple example, let's consider what happens when you connect an electrolyzer to the grid and buy clean energy from existing facilities to match your annual demand. Even though you're claiming the use of this clean energy, in reality, the grid is responding by calling on fossil fuel power plants to ramp up. And why might this be? Well, power grids meet demand by calling on the cheapest available resources. Clean energy generally runs as often as it's available, and wind and solar are free, and nuclear fuel is pretty cheap. So fossil fuels are next in line to serve that new demand caused by electrolyzers. But unlike other clean energy technologies like electric vehicles and heat pumps, electrolyzers are very energy intensive. If they cause fossil fuel power plants to ramp up, they would make emissions as much as 5 times worse than how we make hydrogen today. And you can see how these emissions are extremely far above what's needed to earn the $3 a kilogram tax credit. We also ran a more nuanced analysis by region using today's grid mix in the US, and emissions from electrolysis would be 2 to 4 times as bad as today's processes everywhere in the US without the right rules in place. Luckily, Treasury can set rules that ensure electrolyzers are making truly zero carbon hydrogen. And again, as Rachel and Killian covered, this requires drawing power from new sources of clean energy that can physically deliver their power at the same time that electrolyzers are operating. I only covered the new piece here, but the other two components are also essential pieces of this puzzle to keep emissions in check. And I believe Wilson is going to cover that in a little bit more detail in his presentation. So moving on, another thing we hear is that we just need to sacrifice these near-term emissions as a trade-off to grow the hydrogen industry, which will clean itself up with time as the grid decarbonizes. Because after all, we will need lots of clean hydrogen to meet our net zero economy goals. But we're looking at two potential futures here. If we forego, let's say, time matching in our 45V rules, we'd see developers build cheap but inflexible electrolyzers that can run nonstop. They'd earn a ton in government subsidies, and they'd deliver steady hydrogen to off-takers, but without needing much, if any, midstream infrastructure. If we instead had all three pillars, we'd see developers build higher cost but more flexible systems that can follow changes in renewable energy output. they'd get fewer government subsidies, and they'd need hydrogen storage or maybe pipeline systems to smooth those gaps in production. But an inflexible industry built under loose rules would be in a lot of trouble. Electrolyzers would run nonstop while subsidized. So in this example, they would be incentivized to buy power in all hours, given the value of the $3 a kilogram tax credit and the $1 a kilogram sales price. But once that tax credit expires, they wouldn't be set up to run much less frequently, while still being able to deliver that steady hydrogen supply to off-takers. So you can see in this red line how the range of profitability drops pretty dramatically in a post-subsidy world. And this could cause a lot of trouble for the industry. So the expiration of tax credits could cause stranded assets and lost jobs where projects weren't set up for long-term success. Or we might see Congress extend tax credits and kick the can down the road for another 5 to 10 years. But you can't really avoid the need to build a flexible system if you're going to stay profitable as an industry long-term. So by contrast, stringent tax credit guidance would align incentives with the desired policy outcome that we want. If you build an industry around flexibility where electrolyzers run in a manner that allows for sustained operations and growth after those tax credits expire, you'd be, setting yourself up for success. So in this example, projects are initially built to follow renewable energy output, and electrolyzers would be overbuilt such that they put extra hydrogen into storage in some hours, and then those off-takers pull hydrogen out of storage in other hours. And then when the subsidy expires, you can have new and old electrolyzers alike that could price hunt for that cheap power on the open market and still be able to operate in that more flexible manner. And we're also going to need a lot of flexible demands like electrolyzers to help clean the power grid. So in a world after the subsidies, flexible electrolyzers will need to ramp up and soak up and make use of that excess renewable energy, which is indicated by very low or even negative power prices. And then they can shut down when that power is needed elsewhere, which is signaled by higher power prices that come from the use of fossil power. So lastly, our analysis looked at the financial viability of projects complying with the 3 pillars, and we found that they'd be profitable from day one in much of the US. So to understand this analysis, it's helpful to think of 3 types of project configurations. The first on the left consists of building new clean energy and electrolyzers that are completely disconnected from the power grid. And these are admittedly tough since you'd either have a pretty low utilization rate for your electrolyzer or you would waste a lot of clean power. But there are examples of projects that are making it work today. The second type connects this arrangement to the grid, and you can export your excess clean power to the grid or even turn off your electrolyzer and sell all the power to the grid when it's really valuable, but you can't pull from the grid to power your electrolyzer. So by being connected, you can earn a lot more revenue from monetizing the clean power more readily. And then the third type detaches the electrolyzer from the clean power with the 2 connected only through the grid. And so whereas the first 2 configurations are clearly compliant with the 3 pillars, this type has to do more work to prove compliance. But it is helpful to have the option to site clean power where there's cheap land and good wind quality and site your electrolyzer next to the off-taker. So for our analysis, we looked at export-only projects, that second example, to be conservative and keep things simple. And we tested 3 locations. West Texas, which has great wind and solar and a lot of land. Houston and Southeast Texas, which has good solar, decent wind, and is sited near petrochemical industries. And then West Minnesota, which has good winds, mediocre solar, and is in agriculture country where hydrogen could make ammonia for fertilizer. And we found these projects could easily sell hydrogen at $1 per kilogram and make a profit after paying off their capital costs, the operations and maintenance, financing, and a tax shield. And we restricted the revenue these projects could earn from selling excess energy to the grid and chose low power price years to be conservative. But you can see in the second row of this table that these electrolyzers are still hitting pretty high capacity factors between 80 and 90%. So to wrap up, this graphic gives an idea of where in the US you might be able to make projects that can make things pencil out with the 3 pillars today. And the red stars are the test sites in our analysis. And these areas mostly line up with good onshore wind resources. But that said, as electrolyzer capital costs fall, they'll be viable running much less often. And so over time, these projects will spread out to other parts of the US. Luckily, these green areas today line up with the high value end uses for hydrogen demand, like ammonia production. And in any case, if anything is limiting the deployment of electrolyzers, it's going to be supply chains, not any costs imposed by complying with these three pillars. And so that's all from me. If you're interested to learn more about our analysis, you can just Google Energy Innovation 45V to find our paper. And yeah, thanks for your time, and I'll pass things back to Irina.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I think it was a very good analysis of how this is financial viable, and also you can have compliant project to all the rules that we discussed before. And on this, let me go now to Wilson, our last speaker from Princeton University. And you at Princeton also provided a very robust piece of research and also modeling evidence on today's topic. And there is a publication that we share also with our signatories. Can you maybe, Wilson, tell us a little bit more about this research and explain what are the implications of not incorporating the three pillars approach and all these rules that we just discussed going forward? Over to you, Wilson. Thank you.
Thanks, Irina. Absolutely. And just to introduce myself again, I'm a current graduate researcher at Princeton University in the Zero Carbon Energy Systems Research and Optimization Lab. We are essentially an energy systems modeling and analysis group that works to support large-scale decarbonization efforts, both in the policy and technology spaces through analysis of macro-scale energy systems. As Irina noted, we put out a paper, peer-reviewed paper in Environmental Research Letters in January of this year, which looked at the system-wide impacts of various approaches to the 45V production tax credit. So, the consequences of Treasury's eventual decision on this particularly important policy. I'm going to be presenting on those, which really looked in depth at the impacts of having or not having each of the three pillars. And then also, we've put out a new report that compares the cost analyses of a number of studies on three pillars hydrogen production and shows really what profitable profits or projects would look like under these requirements. So our study of the emissions and cost impacts of the 45V production tax credit was focused on system level outcomes. The importance of this being that, of course, if we're producing clean hydrogen, we want there to be ideally no additional emissions coming from the large, the entire electricity system as a result of that production. And this is, I think, the most important metric to care about because, as opposed to just what our accounting systems show, this is real GHG emissions into the atmosphere. And so to do this, we used our GenX electricity systems optimization model, which is a large-scale economic model that optimizes the planning of the electricity system and operations over short or long-run planning periods to mimic the economic evolution of electricity marketplaces. We used a 6-zone model of the US Western interconnection for this study with a planning year of 2030. So really looking at outcomes over the majority of the decade over which the 45V production tax credit is going to be in effect. And we looked at the impacts on system level emissions of adding electrolysis demands to each of our 6 zones, subject to certain clean energy procurement requirements that would mimic, say, 3 pillars requirements or looser requirements along various dimensions. And so I'm just going to cover each of the 3 pillars one by one and show the results from our study of what happens when you get rid of them. So I think the first thing to note is that under a no requirements case, this one on the left, if we add hydrogen production to the system without making clean electricity procurements, we end up with emissions impacts that are far greater than if we had made that same hydrogen through just the conventional steam methane reforming process, which is exactly what Dan and Rachel and Killian all touched on. What's interesting to note, though, is that just buying annual matched renewable energy certificates, which is kind of a standard way of showing clean electricity procurement for corporations today, actually has zero impact on this consequential outcome. So under our annual matching case, where we have, I guess, two of the three pillars, these being deliverability and additionality. If we get rid of hourly matching, we end up not making any impact at all. However, when we do have hourly matching and have all three pillars working together, we end up seeing emissions outcomes that are actually aligned with the statutory requirements of tax credit, and we end up producing hydrogen, which does not result in any additional emissions in the system. I should also note that the incremental cost of implementing these three pillars, as opposed to not doing anything at all or just implementing annual matching, is not very significant. In our study, we showed that for current electrolyzer costs, $1,200 a kilowatt, you end up with a premium of roughly 50 cents per kilogram of hydrogen in this case, which here still puts you well below the threshold needed to compete on cost with gray hydrogen. In terms of now looking at deliverability, we also modeled cases where, rather than requiring hydrogen production that was essentially in the same grid region as the electricity that it was claiming to use, if we allow claiming of matching electricity over much larger geographic distances that are subject to grid transmission constraints, we actually see that we fail to avoid significant emissions outcomes. So on the left side here, we look at an electrolyzer that's located in our Wyoming and Colorado zone, powered by local solar. And then an electrolyzer located in Northern California, also powered by local solar. And in both those cases, we see emissions outcomes that are below the threshold for the PTC. And then finally, a case where we allow electrolyzer in Wyoming to use solar power located in California, and the emissions impacts are significant. And this is because when congestion prevents the resources that you're claiming to be matching from actually delivering power, you end up relying on local fossil resources instead. And the power that you claim you're using ends up just displacing other clean power in the areas where it's being generated. And the final pillar, additionality or new power. This one is fairly intuitive, but we basically showed that if you allow existing clean resources to qualify for the 45V tax credit, then you're essentially, because you're adding demand to the system from hydrogen, but not adding any new supply, the new power that, the new power has to come from somewhere. And where it comes from is the exact same resources it would have come from had you not made any quote unquote procurements at all. And so we've got our no requirements case, again, with very high emissions, nearly double the gray hydrogen rate. Our hourly matching case, I believe this is from our Southern California region. Hourly matching, again, showing even slightly negative consequential emissions outcomes. And then if we have hourly matching deliverability, but without a new power requirement, we actually get the exact same system-wide outcome as if we had no requirements at all. Now, this is kind of a summary of the outcomes of our model for the importance of each of the three pillars. And again, looking at the impact on system-wide real emissions into the atmosphere resulting from our implementation of different policies. I'm now going to switch gears and look at a kind of meta-analysis of the cost of the three pillars, which is comparing a range of studies that have come out recently that are attacking exactly this topic. As Rachel noted, some of the opposition to the three pillars comes from those who argue that they are expensive, that they would harm scale up of the hydrogen industry. And so the purpose of this study is to assess all of the various analyses that have assessed the cost of the three pillars and explore why they come to different conclusions. So I'll just say up front that most studies find that even with the three pillars, subsidized hydrogen production in the US will be competitive from day one, just like Dan showed earlier. However, there are a couple studies that disagree, and our recent report on this explains why. The two studies that have shown higher costs are actually from Rhodium Group and Wood Mackenzie, both Wood Mackenzie being an energy consultancy and Rhodium being a independent analysis group. And so I'm just going to kind of briefly go through this and explain why studies get the results they do. Here is a comparison of all the electrolyzer cost assumptions from each of these studies. You can see that most of them fall between roughly $700 and $1,500 a kilowatt. This is also the range cited by IRENA for current electrolyzer costs. Wood Mackenzie, one of the studies that shows very high costs, you can kind of see why. It's because they assume electrolyzer costs at $2,200 a kilowatt, which is far outside the accepted range. The other key factor in overall cost of a clean hydrogen project that's three pillars compliant is the cost of clean electricity, and particularly the utilization rate you can achieve with that clean electricity. This plot shows the range of outcomes for clean electricity cost and availability from each of these studies. What I want everyone to focus on here is that these filled in markers are from studies that assumes that you could oversize clean electricity relative to electrolyzer, so actually optimizing the system to maximize your economic value, and that you can sell clean electricity into electricity markets during times when you're producing more than your electrolyzer is using. And when these kind of operations are allowed, you end up with very high utilization rates, even for projects requiring the three pillars, which is really the major complaint of opponents of the three pillars, is that they force you to operate significantly less often. I'll note that the other study that found very high costs for hourly matching was the Rhodium study, which is down here, which assumed a solar only system that had to operate a 100 megawatt electrolyzer with a 100 megawatt solar facility, leading to extremely low utilization rates, which is not a realistic project design when you look at these ones that are actually optimized to the task. And then finally here, I'm just going to show a couple plots of how the levelized cost of hydrogen is affected by these studies. This plot shows the different electricity cost and utilization rates from each of these studies for a given electrolyzer cost. So this is $1,750 per kilowatt. This is the very most conservative cost cited by the DOE for small electrolyzer projects today. You can see that even at this very high cost, you still have projects that are hourly matched, all being competitive when they're optimized in this way. As you, and as Dan said, these are likely to be located in places that have decent wind and solar power. But as you move down the electrolyzer cost curve, as these subsidies are designed to do by subsidizing early projects, which then expand manufacturing and reduce electrolyzer costs, you can see that gradually projects that rely on only single renewables, and then eventually projects essentially anywhere, even Rhodium's very conservative solar only project, become significantly profitable. And the overall impact of utilization rate, you can see these lines are a lot flatter, is much lower, which means that the geographic differences in the cost of producing clean hydrogen are reduced, and we can expect to see it be profitable nationwide. So that's just a rapid fire summary of some of our recent analysis. Happy to pass it back to you, Irina, and answer any questions the audience has.
Thank you, Wilson. Very, very interesting. And I will encourage all our audience and signatories to have a look at this robust piece of research. We passed it already, but please, Wilson, feel free also to pass it in the chat for anyone that hasn't looked into that in depth to have a chance to do that. We have 10 minutes left. Unfortunately, not so much for Q&A, but I've seen that many of you already replied to some of the questions that emerged. So thank you very much for that. I would like maybe to select a couple of them and to direct it to one of you. one that I think is a very good follow-up on this last presentation, and maybe Rachel, I will ask you to reply to that. I saw that you also underline that you would like to address this one, is on the pro and cons arguments, and rightly it was referring on Princeton, but also E3 analysis. And if anyone has tried to reconcile these seemingly opposite conclusions. Rachel, do you want to answer this?
Yes, I got so excited when I saw this question. I actually wanted to note that Wilson Rick should absolutely take this question, and I raised my hand erroneously. So Wilson, I will put you on the spot because he's been doing some extremely interesting thinking about the differences between the two. So Wilson.
Sure. So yeah, this is a very energy systems analyst wonky question, but it really comes down to the scope of impacts that the studies were considering. You'll notice that the E3 study obviously came to very different conclusions from our own, saying that, oh, actually annual matching leads to, completely okay emissions outcomes that are, not any worse than hourly, and ours showed that annual matching is completely ineffective, which are very, very different results. This really comes down to the scope of impacts that were considered. So our study is an economic equilibrium. It assumes that, as a participant in electricity markets, the behavior of the hydrogen producer in procuring new clean electricity to power their hydrogen, either hourly or annual matched, has an impact on the incentives and decisions for other participants in the electricity market. So if you, generate solar power during the day, that's going to have an impact on solar power prices or on electricity prices during the day, which is going to impact other solar developers' decisions over whether to build projects. And this is how we expect, any kind of, organic marketplace to work. The E3 study is what you call a short run analysis, which ignores that particular impact. It basically focuses only on, if we build a solar project, then that forces fossil plants to ramp down right now. And it doesn't actually look at the impact of, well, if we build that solar project, how does that affect the deployment of other solar power in the system? And so, while the impact of building a solar project might be very high immediately, we find that it actually trends towards zero if you're just generating excess solar power to offset your very real use of fossil power at night, because over time that excess solar power ends up just displacing other solar projects that would have otherwise been built. And so that's the real, key detail to pay attention to, and it's something that we need the offsets that are being claimed for compliance with 45V to be effective for the entire lifetime of a project, not just the first year of its operation before any of these other impacts can be taken into account. And I'll know that these kinds of indirect impacts are exactly what is cited in federal legal standards for calculating the overall emissions impact of a given action.
Thank you very much, Wilson.
The only thing I would add is, this is great. The way I think of it is the E3 study and others don't reflect reality, right? They assume a kind of a frozen system where a hydrogen project doesn't impact anything else. That's not how reality works, right? A hydrogen project, like any other player in the market, will affect the market structure, and will, if we don't have these pillars, drive fossil fuels on the system. Annual matching being one of those looser rules that will enable that.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Wilson. I think that was a very good answer. And we go now to Killian. Killian, this question is for you. You said hourly RECs are available today across the entire US as long as the hourly data is available. Do your orders have a sense of where the hourly data is actually available to the tracking system?
Yeah, sure. Taking the Emirates example, like all across the MISO region, they have something like 150 terawatt hours, 150 million, hourly RECs essentially in their system today. PJM are obviously offering this across their system. I think the key point here is that, if there's a requirement for hourly matching, then you just have an hourly production meter and an hourly consumption meter, and you match them with a rec. It's really far from rocket science. I've worked on projects exactly doing this in Europe. So once the requirement is there, obviously the hourly data will be there, because otherwise folks won't get $3 a kilo. And I think that's the kind of key thing to keep in mind here. That is different to saying that hourly data is available for every single production and consumption point across the US right now. That's not yet the case, but that doesn't need to be the case for this tax credit to be implemented. So yeah, hopefully that clarifies that.
Thank you, Killian. I think it does. Last question for Daniel from Evan Ramsey. Do these studies account for emissions reductions for the end use of hydrogen? Daniel?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in general, these studies are only looking upstream, not what hydrogen displaces downstream. And there's a few reasons for that. One is that in the US, the tax credit is just designed on a production basis. So the law is very specific around considering upstream and production emissions and not looking downstream, just how the law was designed. But you might think, well, is this a big deal if hydrogen is displacing a lot of emissions downstream? Can we just kind of not really be concerned about this? And unfortunately, it's not the case because unlike in the EU, the US has no demand side policy for hydrogen. And so we don't know where it's going to go, but we have a pretty good idea that if there's just a ton of artificially cheap hydrogen from projects that can just be annually matched with existing clean energy, it's mostly gas utilities that are raising their hand and saying, hey, we're an easy off taker. We have this natural gas pipeline system that has a huge volume. You can blend at least up to 5% hydrogen into our pipelines and we'll buy it. And we will use this as a way of saying, hey, look, we're reducing our carbon emissions. And that kind of eases pressure for gas utilities to do things like help electrify buildings, for example. But burning hydrogen in place of burning natural gas is by far the worst use case. For hydrogen, you would reduce something like 6 kilograms of carbon dioxide per kilogram of hydrogen, while potentially making hydrogen that's 40 to 50 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen. So this might not be a big deal, honestly, if all of the hydrogen was guaranteed to replace metallurgical coal and steel making, for example. But it's going to take a lot of work for us to make that a reality. And so for the foreseeable future, frankly, we're going to need to make sure that hydrogen is truly zero carbon, in part because we don't know what it's replacing downstream.
Thank you very much, Daniel, on these last words and strong dose of reality check. We can conclude today's discussion. I think it was very interesting. Let me give the floor to my colleague, Sakshi Chandra, UN Energy Engagement Analyst, for the last wrap up and call to action. And thanks again for being with us. Sakshi, over to you.
Thanks so much, Irina. And thank you, everyone. I just want to conclude today's really thought-provoking discussion on clean hydrogen and importance of a robust emissions accounting system. I want to start by expressing my deepest gratitude to our panel of experts for sharing their knowledge and perspectives and sharing their time with us today. As we move forward, let us recognize the critical role that clean hydrogen plays in the global energy transition and the need for strong guidelines to ensure its sustainable deployment. Also, in light of today's conversation, we would like to call on companies and organizations to engage and discuss on this message of truly clean hydrogen for their US and global efforts. If you would like to learn more or join this conversation, please feel free to reach out to us on email. Also directly to Killian, we will be happy to share sort of the contact information following this call. We encourage you to continue engaging in discussions around the three-pillar approach. Share your insights and collaborate with each other to promote truly low or zero emitting hydrogen projects, and use the HiveBright community platform to really start these conversations. Together, we can help shape a cleaner and more sustainable energy future. Finally, I know a lot of you might have missed, or your colleagues would miss this event. So the recording would be available along with the presentation decks shortly on the website. And once again, yes, thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to having you for all our future events.
Thank you very much. And just let me remind that this will be put in our website with the slides of all the presenters. Thank you so much, and see you next webinar of 24/7 Carbon Free Energy. Bye, everyone.